Okay, thank you, Amanda. Yeah, that's a wonderful presentation and lots of key messages there that definitely resonate with what we're aiming to do with the rest of the day, and also focused on in terms of implementation of the ISE 2027. I think just from this next presentation, I'm going to be focusing on work package 1, which is the analysis of the CCQ data. Just to highlight that, for this presentation and the ones that follow, it's really a subset of the findings. This is a very large project, and I know in the subsequent presentations, it would be highlighted quite how much data we've collected across the project, but we're very much focused on some of the key findings from the project today, the ones that we feel are most relevant to the audience today, but also the ones that are going to hopefully focuses more on that transition from 2021 to 2027. And that's definitely what I've aimed to do in this presentation. So there we go. It's just a little bit slow moving on to the next slide there. So I presented the methods for the projects earlier on. So just to highlight work package 1 here, we're focused on, what are those key components of global education delivery post ISE? So what does education look like? What does it look like based on the CCQ responses post ISE? But also, how have these changed compared to pre-ISE? So there we've got direct comparisons of data from the 2017 CCQ responses to those in 2022, and then a little bit later for Tier 4 organisations, we've made those direct comparisons. But then when we've got just responses that are relevant to post-ISE, then we're focused very much on what does that education delivery look like post-ISE, but also how does that differ between Tier 1 to Tier 4? And that's very much to look at those research questions around ADOs of different size and funding levels to see whether we're seeing any systematic differences. And what we'll see is that certainly for some of the responses, we're seeing evidence of some systematic differences, but not for all of them, which is interesting in itself, I think. So just to highlight first, to look at athlete and ASP education and how that's differed. So we've got within the CCQ responses of the number of athletes and ASP educated across the tiers 1 to 4 in 2017 versus 2022. And I think what we're seeing here highlighted straight away is the difference in the volume of education delivery, or the number of athletes being educated from pre to post ISE. So significant difference here. I mean, I don't think anyone would argue with that. Now, I have presented these findings, and also, interestingly, ASP delivery is not mandated within ISE 2021, but we're still seeing a significant increase in the education of ASP, which is good to see as well. I have presented some of these findings, not all of them, to ADOs on a couple of occasions, which has been really good. And some of the feedback on this particular or these particular findings has been around the ability to deliver online, but really being sort of a game changer. And I think the requirement to do that through COVID as well was a big learning experience for organisations. So this might explain some of the differences in the number of athletes and ASP educated, but I think there's still a strong influence of the ISE here in terms of number of athletes and ASP receiving education. So if we move on to look at other indicators of the volume of education delivery, so we look at the actual number of sessions in the reporting period. So that's the year leading up to the completion of the CCQ for each organisation. I think there's a couple of things that we see here that are quite clear. One, that there's more education sessions are delivered by NADOs than by IFs. So consistently across Tier 1, 2, 3 and 4, we're seeing that difference between NADOs. A significant number of sessions, the difference is there. But also, when we look across the tiers, it's a majority of the education sessions being delivered are by Tier 1 NADOs. So there's a big difference in terms of the differences between the NADOs across the different tiers. Interesting, we do see a slight sort of uptick in the number of sessions in Tier 4, and that might be something that resonates with some of the other findings that we're seeing when we're looking for those systematic differences across the tiers. So as we move through, that's definitely something to keep a look on today. In terms of education plan content, so this is a comparison from 2017 to 2022. This is where we've got responses in terms of those mandated core ISE components. That questions were there in 2017 that we can make a comparison to. So I think what a consistent finding across all these four is that we're seeing a significant increase in those core ISE components being delivered. So that's in terms of monitoring and evaluation of the education plan, increasing from 27.8 all the way up to 82%. And we're seeing similar increases for the delivery of other forms of education delivery. So beyond anti-doping education, when we're looking at values-based awareness raising and information provision, having the ISE, the requirement to cover those other aspects of anti-doping and clean sport education has really helped facilitate an increase in those components being addressed. I think if we go on to look at just the post-2022, so the post-ISE data, the 2022 completions across the different tiers, we look at these 5 mandatory components. We're seeing that similar pattern that I talked about when we looked at the education delivery in terms of volume. So we're seeing a decrease as we move from tier 1 through to tier 3, but then a slight increase as we come to tier 4, which is interesting. So probably the way that I'm interpreting or we're interpreting that at the moment is potentially that tier 4 completed the CCQ a little bit later than the other tiers. So perhaps they've had a little bit longer to actually start to put things in place. So it might be that these numbers would look different for the other tiers if we were to if they were to complete the CCQ at this point in time. But it might be that there's other explanations as well in terms of their remit being very tightly focused on the majority in terms of particular sports in tier 4. But looking across the different mandatory components, I think the other thing to point out here is that probably monitoring and evaluation is the one where we're seeing the slightly lower compliance across the tiers on the whole as well. And that resonates certainly with some of the other findings from other aspects of our project. I think if we look at those, so that now we're again focused on post-ISE implementation, so the 2022 completion. If we look across value-based awareness raising, information provision and anti-doping education across the 4 tiers, we're seeing not too many differences. We're seeing high levels of compliance, but we are seeing on the whole that drop from tier 1 to tier 3, and then that slight increase for tier 4, for at least for some of the components, if not for all. In particular, the one to highlight here, I think, is that values-based education, again, is a little bit lower than for the other 3 components. So that suggests, and I think that's what's useful in some of these findings, is showing us that that might be where some of the greater challenges for organisations are in terms of values-based education. And when we're seeing low levels of compliance in other areas, maybe that's suggesting that they're the more challenging areas and the ones where more support is needed or would be helpful. And probably is already starting to be put in place, as we're aware of as well. If we look at the education pool in terms of who's included within the education pool, and for this analysis, I'm very much focused on, so there are obviously other groups we could have included here, but I've focused here very much on aspects that might be, that are looking to be mandatory in 2027. So education is going to need to be delivered to these groups in 2027, suggesting where we might have, bodies of knowledge that people can draw upon, but also where there's less experience. And in terms of coaches, I think we're not seeing huge differences from pre to post ISE in terms of delivery to these groups. Slight increase in coaches for some of the tiers, but not all. So I think we're not seeing great differences there, but what we are seeing is that there's less experience for delivery to minors and to parents. So that the requirement to deliver that for those competing at international competitions, that might be an area that where support is going to be needed. I think on the whole, there's probably greater experience, especially with coaches here, with some of the tier 1 organisations and tier 2 as well for post ISE, that maybe some of the other tiers could draw upon as well. I think and this certainly resonates with some of the other analyses that we've done. When we look at the volume of education delivery, and when again we'll look a little bit later at educator training, it really highlights the amount of education that is delivered. And we saw earlier in terms of the number of sessions delivered, a lot of the education delivery globally that's happening in terms of the number of athletes, ASP and children here, is being delivered by Tier 1 NADA. So there's a great deal of experience there that maybe, and I know there's a lot of collaborative efforts in some areas of the globe, and they should definitely be promoted, I think, going forward to help draw upon that experience when we're looking to deliver, say, to ASP or minors for the first time. There's going to be a body of knowledge that can be drawn upon within the Tier 1 NADOs. But this is quite striking for me, I think, just in terms of the numbers that are delivered by those by the Tier 1 NADOs. And then if we move on to that analysis relating to educators, so as many of you will be aware, in 2027 there's going to be the requirement to train educators, to have accredited trained educators. So we focus this analysis, and I include this analysis for that reason. Now, I think if we look at the chart on the left, it's quite clear that there's nothing systematic in terms of moving from Tier 1 to Tier 4 in terms of the percentage of ADOs with trained educators. That varies across the different tiers. There are differences, but there's nothing systematic there that suggests it's to do with the size or scale of the organisation. But I think where we are seeing a systematic change is when we look on the right in terms of the number of educators per ADO, and this relates to that volume of education delivery that we've just seen. Clearly, if you're going to be delivering much more education, you need more educators. So if we look at the left-hand side and see that 70% of ADOs have trained educators, and then we've got an average of over 70 educators per ADO, there's a body of knowledge in terms of training of educators there that will be useful going forward. Now, that's not to say that the training that's been in place today would be fully compliant with what's required for 2027, but at least it's good experience with training and accrediting educators that can then be drawn upon it and used going forward. So again, this is quite striking in terms of the number of educators that lie with Tier 1 NADOs for us, but also it's consistent with what we're seeing in terms of the volume of education and where that lies. Another element of the IAC 2027 is the suggestion that education should be informed by social science research. And this is certainly something that we'll explore and will be discussed in the later presentations as well. But obviously, as social science research is something that we're very interested in as well, because we can understand the potential benefit here, and we want our work to be informing education. So I think if we look on the left-hand side here in terms of either funding their own social science research, and we certainly saw examples of that with our work directly with ADOs, which is great to see, but also involvement in social science research, potentially as participants or testing interventions and so on. We are seeing some systematic differences. So Tier 4 didn't complete this, that's why they didn't have this question, but from Tier 1 to 3 we do see significant and large differences as we move through the tiers in terms of the involvement or funding of social science research. So in terms of that requirement to utilise social science research, again, it's the Tier 1 organisations potentially have more experience and more knowledge that can be drawn upon through collaboration there. If we look on the right-hand side in terms of the use of social science research, we see quite marked differences between Tier 1 and Tier 2 and 3 again, not so much of a difference between Tier 2 and 3, but we're seeing that sort of that uptick, that bounce with Tier 4. That's potentially because they've had more time to implement these elements, but it could be that other things explain that, but we are seeing that pattern in the results as well. So we're seeing the perception that quite a lot of organisations in Tier 1 are utilising social science research, but only around about a third for Tier 2, Tier 3. So there's a gap obviously to close there in terms of their utilisation of social science research going forward. Potentially a gap that's already been closed since the CCQ responses were received. In terms of evaluation of the education programme, and I think this is quite interesting because we saw the responses earlier in terms of the monitoring and evaluation earlier, where we saw higher percentages. When we focus specifically on the evaluation of the education programme here, we see lower responses. And this is definitely consistent with what we saw when we worked directly with the ADOs in Work Package 2, in terms of evaluation definitely being an area where organisations find it quite challenging. So the monitoring, the data is often easier to collect and also perhaps more intuitive, whereas the evaluation of the education programme and then the use going forward is more difficult and more challenging, and maybe where the more support is needed. But we are seeing that systematic drop from Tier 1 down to Tier 3 as well. And again, that sort of uptick for Tier 4 that I mentioned earlier. But certainly an area that support, I think, will be helpful here. But again, this is perhaps a gap that's already starting to be closed. So they're the main findings that I wanted to present from Work Package 1. As I mentioned earlier, if there are any questions that you want the research team to answer, you can put those into the question and answer, and we will answer those offline. Just some of the key things that I want to highlight from this presentation. I think overall we're seeing good evidence of a positive influence of the ISE on education delivery, both in terms of the quantity of education delivery to athletes and ASP, but also into the breadth, the different forms, the different types of education delivery, but also in terms of addressing the different mandatory elements of the ISE. The majority of the anti-doping organisation thought they were, perceived that they were addressing those mandatory elements, which is great to see. And also, obviously, through the corrective actions, we see some of those gaps already being closed, as well as Tony will come on to speak about a little bit later. So in terms of the Tier 1 NADOs, that we're seeing big differences in terms of Tier 1 NADOs delivering more of the education and also having the experienced training educators, which is going to be important for 2027. And also they address the mandatory elements of the IC. We do see for some of these elements, the drop off from Tier 1 down to Tier 3, but it is interesting and something we'll seek to understand as we explore the results more in terms of what might, and particularly our Tier 4 data, which is quite fresh in terms of trying to understand what might explain that increase for Tier 4 for some of the responses. So thank you very much. I'm going to pass on to Martin now, who is going to present on the second element of Work Package 1, which is around the education plans and his document analysis, qualitative analysis of those plans. Thank you.
You all good? Right. Hello, everyone. Lovely to see you here. Thank you for that, Ian. My name is Dr. Martin Chandler. I was leading on the qualitative analysis for education plans and evaluation reports. So we were just checking whether or not whether the slides are actually up yet, because there's a bit of is it all there? Okay, good. Okay. So the idea behind this part of the project was to qualitatively analyse the education plans and the evaluation reports and see whether or not there would come systematic differences between organisations from different tier levels, and see how WADA can support development of those education plans, because of course those education plans are crucial for providing structure in delivering education and kind of consistency across the globe. We had a very large number of plans provided. So rather than try to analyse absolutely all of them, we went for a representative subset of 5 NADOs and 5 sports federations for each tier. So the representation bit is with NADOs. We were looking for global representation, so things like geographic areas, Americas, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Middle East, and so on. For sports federations, because a lot of them are based in Europe, we try to get a broad representation of both team and individual sports for each tier. So we analysed the education plans using some categories that were defined by the ISC, so things like situation assessment, education pool, and so on. And I'm going to go through each one of these sections now and just talk a little bit about